The air in director Kaylin Vance's office was a meticulously curated lie. Recycled, filtered to a sterile perfection, it carried no trace of the city's smog, no hint of organic life, save for the single, severe obsidian orchid bleeding purple into the grey schematic of the room. It was air scrubbed clean of truth, and yet, for Elian, it was suffocatingly full of him. Kaylin's scent was a ghost that refused to be exorcised, a phantom limb of their shared secret. It was the scent of petrichor and cold stone, a deep, resonant chord that vibrated in Elian's bones, a constant, silent declaration that contradicted every word the director spoke. It clung to the ionized atmosphere, saturated the fibers of the charcoal grey carpet, and settled on Elian's skin like a second, invisible layer. A brand, a claim, a cage. He stood by the vast chromo-glass window, his own reflection, a pale, translucent shimmer against the spire-choked skyline of Ethelberg. His suit was immaculate, the standard assistant's uniform of muted silver grey, tailored to be both presentable and forgettable. He was a function, a tool. His job was to anticipate, to facilitate, to disappear into the background until needed. He was good at it. He had learned the art of stillness, of making his presence so minimal it barely registered. But his own biology betrayed him. The subtle, sweet scent of rain-touched clover and parchment that was his own Omega signature was permanently, irrevocably overlaid with Kaylin's dominant alpha musk. Anyone with a moderately sensitive nose could tell. Any alpha would recognize the possessive, territorial marking. He was claimed, and he was denied. The intercom chimed, a soft, triple-beat tone that sliced through the quiet. Elian. Kaylin's voice was as controlled as the office's atmosphere, a low baritone devoid of warmth. The quarterly projections, now. Elian turned from the window, his reflection dissolving. He moved to the sleek obsidian desk that dominated the room like an altar. He did not look at Kaylin, not directly. He had learned that too. Direct eye contact was an invitation, a challenge, an intimacy Kaylin could not afford. Instead, he focused on the director's hands as he placed the datapad on the polished surface. Long, elegant fingers, a heavy signet ring on his right hand. The hands of a man who built empires and crushed dissent with equal dispassionate precision. The Sector 7 logistics are still showing a 4% deficit, Director, Elian said, his voice a practiced, level monotone. I've highlighted the anomalous data streams. Kaylin didn't look at the datapad. His gaze, a piercing glacial blue, was fixed on Elian's neck, just above the crisp collar of his shirt. Elian felt the look like a physical touch, a cold spark against the place where, months ago, in a moment of primal, uncontrolled terror when a security bulkhead had nearly crushed them, Kaylin's teeth had grazed his skin. There was no visible mark, but the scent gland beneath had been irrevocably triggered, awakened and bonded by the sheer force of the alpha's protective instinct, a biological imperative that had sealed their fates and ruined Elian's future. See that it's rectified, Kaylin said, his eyes finally lifting to meet Elian's. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. The director vanished, and in his place was the alpha, a flicker of raw possession in those cold eyes, a darkness that promised both safety and ruin. Then it was gone. He was Director Vance again. And cancel my 18 appointment with the consortium. Something has come up. Yes, Director. Elian retreated, his movements fluid and silent. He was almost to the door when Kaylin spoke again, his voice carrying a deliberate, public weight. as if rehearsing for an audience. "Elian," he paused. "Ensure my vehicle is prepped for the summit tomorrow. We leave at 05 war sharp. A good assistant is always prepared." A good assistant. The words were precise, clinical, each one a stone laid on the wall between them. He was not a partner. He was not a mate. He was not the Omega whose scent Kalen carried on his own clothes like a dirty secret, scrubbed away each night with harsh chemical soaps. He was an assistant, an asset, a complication to be managed. Elian's hand rested on the cool metal of the door panel. He didn't turn around. He couldn't let Kalen see the tremor in his fingers or the bitter irony that tightened his mouth. The entire world could be told he was just an assistant. The whole city could believe the lie. But Kalen's own scent, the very essence of his alpha nature, told a different story. It was a story of primal ownership, screamed in a language older than words, older than the sterile corporation they served. And it was a story that was slowly, methodically, erasing Elian from his own life. He was a ghost in Kalen's world, haunted by a scent that should have been his home, but had instead become the architecture of his prison. He opened the door and stepped out, the controlled air of the director's inner sanctum replaced by the slightly warmer, more populated air of the executive suite. But the scent followed him. It always followed him. It was on his skin, in his hair, woven into the very fabric of his being. He was Director Vance's assistant, but he was Kalen's Omega. And the contradiction was a chasm threatening to swallow him whole. He felt the stares of the other staff, the betas whose expressions were carefully neutral, the other alphas whose nostrils flared with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. They smelled it. They all smelled it. The unspoken truth, and in their world, a world built on hierarchy and control, an Omega so flagrantly marked, yet so publicly unacknowledged, was an anomaly, a scandal waiting to happen, an object of pity and scorn. Elian kept his eyes forward, his posture perfect, his face a mask of serene efficiency. He was not an anomaly. He was not a scandal. He was an assistant. He repeated the words in his mind, a mantra against the truth. He was an assistant. He was an assistant. But the scent of petrichor and cold stone laughed at the lie, a silent, thunderous roar that only he could truly hear. Kalen waited until the door slid shut, the sound a soft, definitive hiss that sealed him back into his isolation. He did not move. He stared at the spot where Elian had stood, a faint, shimmering disturbance in the air, a ghost of a presence that was more real to him than the sprawling metropolis laid out beyond the window. He could still smell him. Underneath the oppressive weight of his own marking scent, the delicate, clean fragrance of clover and old paper lingered. It was a scent that frayed the edges of his control, a subtle poison that worked its way into the cracks of his armor. He was a man defined by control. From the precise knot of his tie to the calculated cadence of his speech, every aspect of his existence was a testament to disciplined order. He managed a multi-trillion credit corporation that shaped global policy. He commanded divisions, orchestrated market takeovers, and dictated the futures of millions with the cool detachment of a god moving pieces on a board. Yet in his own office, he was undone by the scent of a single Omega. An Omega he was systematically destroying. He closed his eyes, and the memory, sharp and visceral, ambushed him. The shriek of tearing metal, the percussive boom of the failing pressure lock, the dust and the darkness, and the sudden, overwhelming spike of terror in the air. Elian's terror. It had hit him like a physical blow, bypassing his intellect, his training, his carefully constructed walls of command, and striking deep into the oldest part of his brain, the part that was purely alpha. He hadn't thought. He had moved. He had thrown himself and Elian into a maintenance alcove an instant before the 2-ton bulkhead had slammed down, shearing through the corridor where they had been standing. And in that cramped, dark space, with Elian's slight body trembling against his, and the scent of his fear a potent, irresistible catalyst, his instincts had overwhelmed him. The growl that had ripped from his chest was not his own. The possessive, desperate act of sinking his teeth against the soft skin of Elian's neck, of releasing his own scent in a tidal wave of ownership, was an act of pure, unadulterated biology. Mine. The single, primal thought had consumed him. Mine. To protect. Mine. To keep. The aftermath had been a cold, horrifying dawn of clarity. He had marked his own assistant. He had irrevocably bonded himself to an Omega in a moment of weakness, a subordinate with no family, no connections, no political value. A beautiful, quiet, achingly vulnerable Omega who now wore Kalen's scent like a target. His first instinct had been to mitigate, to control the damage. He had classified. The incident silenced the few witnesses with promotions and threats, and constructed the narrative. Elian was his brilliant, indispensable assistant. Nothing more. It was a lie born of necessity, a lie born of fear. Not fear for his career. He could weather that. It was fear rooted deeper in the history of his own bloodline. He walked to the window, the city lights beginning to glitter like a field of fallen stars. He saw not the city, but the face of his grandfather, a proud, powerful alpha whose empire had crumbled to dust, all because of a publicly claimed Omega from a rival house. A bond that was seen as a weakness, an emotional liability. It had been exploited, used to manipulate him, and ultimately to destroy him and his entire family. Kalen had spent his life rebuilding, clawing his way back to the top, vowing never to repeat that mistake. Emotion was a vulnerability. Attachment was a weapon that could be turned against you. And a bond. A bond was a death sentence. His protection of Elian was, in its own twisted way, a form of this control. By denying the bond, by keeping him close but publicly distant, he believed he was shielding him. If no one knew Elian was his weakness, no one could use him. It was a cold, cruel calculus, and the cost was Elian's identity, his spirit, his right to be acknowledged. A cost Kalen told himself was necessary. He was not a monster. He was a strategist. He was not a callous brute. He was a protector. The lies he told the world were nothing compared to the lies he told himself. He touched the cool surface of the glass, his own reflection staring back, a man trapped in a prison of his own making. He saw the faint smudge of his breath on the pane and was reminded of the warmth of Elian's body pressed against his in that dark alcove. The memory was a spark of heat in the frozen landscape of his soul. He had told Elian to prepare the vehicle for the summit. It was a necessary trip, but it was also a test. Days in close proximity, surrounded by the most powerful, predatory alphas on the continent. Alphas who would smell the truth on Elian, whose instincts would drive them to test the strength of an unclaimed marking. It was a risk, a terrible, calculated risk, but it was also a way to reinforce the lie, to present Elian as a mere functionary in the face of overwhelming scrutiny. He had to prove to the world and to himself that the bond meant nothing, that he was in control. But as he stood there, the ghost of clover and parchment teasing his senses, he felt the first terrifying tremor in the foundations of his perfectly ordered world. The lie was beginning to feel heavier than the truth, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that control was just an illusion, a beautiful, fragile illusion that was about to be shattered. The scent-neutralizing patches were a small, daily humiliation. Elian pressed the cool, clinical-smelling square to the skin just below his ear, covering the gland that pulsed with a faint, traitorous warmth. He applied another to his wrist. The chemical compound was designed to mask pheromones, to render the wearer a blank slate in a world that communicated through scent. For most, it was a tool of professional discretion. For Elian, it was an act of self-erasure. The neutralizer fought a losing battle against the sheer potency of Kalen's mark. It was like trying to hide a forest fire with a linen sheet. The scent of petrichor and stone was too deep, too fundamental. It had seeped into his very chemistry. The patches only managed to muddy it, to create a confusing, dissonant olfactory signal that drew more attention than it deflected. It made him smell like a secret. He smoothed the collar of his uniform, his reflection in the polished steel of his small apartment's service locker, looking back at him. Pale, composed, a study in quiet efficiency. But his eyes told a different story. There were shadows beneath them, the fine-grained exhaustion of a man living a double life, neither half of which was his own. He was Kalen's Omega in private, a biological fact that hummed beneath his skin, a constant, low-grade fever. He was Director Vance's assistant in public, a role he performed with meticulous, soul-crushing perfection. But who was Elian? He no longer knew. The person he had been before the accident, the quiet but hopeful young man who had excelled at the corporate academy, who had dreamed of a respectable career, maybe even a gentle beta partner someday, felt like a character from a novel he'd once read. A stranger's history. His comm unit chimed, and a name flashed on the screen that made his stomach clench. Marcus Thorne, board member, alpha of the old guard, from a family whose power was ancient and predatory. Thorne had taken a particular, unsettling interest in Elian over the past few weeks. His public interactions were flawless. A polite nod in the corridor, a brief professional inquiry about a report. But his scent was a violation. It was heavy and cloying, like overripe fruit and hot metal, and he always let it brush against Elian, a deliberate, invasive question. This one is marked, but where is his alpha? Is he up for grabs? Elian ignored the call. He could not afford to engage. Any interaction would be noted, logged, and likely reviewed by Kalen's security detail. Kalen saw everything. His control was absolute. It was in the way he monitored network traffic, the way he reviewed security logs from the executive floor, the way his gaze would sometimes sweep over Elian, sharp and assessing, as if he could see the phantom touch of Thorne's scent on his skin. He had to be careful. Every move he made was scrutinized. Every deviation from his role as the perfect, invisible assistant, a potential threat. He gathered his travel kit for the summit, the movements precise and economical. He was a machine of efficiency because emotion was a luxury he could not afford. To feel anger at his situation was to risk letting it show. To feel despair was to falter. To feel the strange, terrifying pull of the bond toward the man who denied him. That was the most dangerous feeling of all. It was a treacherous current that threatened to pull him under, to make him accept this half-life as his reality. Sometimes, in the dead of night, he would wake up, his heart pounding, his body aching with a profound, instinctual loneliness. The bond was a two-way street. It craved proximity, reassurance, completion. It was a biological imperative for a mated pair. But they were not a pair. They were a director and his assistant. And the bond, starved and twisted, was becoming a source of torment. He zipped the bag shut and stood for a moment in the silence of his small, state-allotted apartment. It was as sterile and impersonal as Kalen's office, just on a smaller scale. There were no photographs, no personal mementos, nothing to suggest a life lived, only a life endured. He was a man in waiting. But what was he waiting for? For Kalen to acknowledge him? The thought was a bitter laugh in the quiet of his mind. Kalen would sooner liquidate a division than show that kind of vulnerability. Was he waiting for an opportunity to escape? But where would he go? A marked Omega with no connections, no wealth, running from one of the most powerful men in the world. He would be found. He would be brought back. His cage would only become smaller. The comm unit chimed again. Marcus Thorne. Persistent. Predatory. Elian's hand tightened on the handle of his bag. A flicker of something hot and sharp, something that felt dangerously like defiance, sparked in his chest. He was tired of being a ghost. He was tired of being a secret. He was tired of the scent of lies. For the first time, a new question began to form in his mind, quiet but insistent. He wasn't waiting for Kalen to save him or for an opportunity to run. Perhaps he was waiting for the courage to save himself. The thought was terrifying. It was a seed of rebellion planted in the barren soil of his resignation. He didn't know what it meant or what he would do, but as he left his apartment to meet the man who owned his scent but refused his soul, the seed began to feel less like a fantasy and more like a necessity. He would go to the summit. He would play his part. He would be the perfect assistant. But he would be watching, and he would be learning, because the one thing Kalen's cold, calculated world had taught him was that information was power, and power was the only thing that could ever set him free. The Elysian summit was held at a remote, fortified retreat, nestled in the snow-capped peaks of the Seraphine Mountains. It was a place where the world's power brokers could meet in absolute privacy, surrounded by brutalist architecture and breathtaking, indifferent nature. The air here was thin and cold, so pure it felt sharp in the lungs. It should have been a relief after the recycled atmosphere of the city. But for Kalen, it was a new kind of torture. The clean air did nothing to dilute the pheromonal soup of the summit. It was a gathering of the world's most dominant alphas, and their collective scent was a thick, oppressive fog of ambition, aggression, and power. It was a constant, low-level assault on his senses, putting his own instincts on high alert. And through it all, a single, terrifying scent acted as his anchor and his torment, Elian's. Even with the neutralizers, Kalen could smell the sweet clover, now laced with the thin, sharp scent of mountain air. It was a beacon in the storm of alpha pheromones, and he knew with a sickening certainty that every other alpha in the vicinity could smell it too. They were in the grand hall for the opening reception, a cavernous space of polished granite and stark, unforgiving light. Elian stood a few paces behind him, his posture impeccable, his expression a perfect blank. He was the very model of a subordinate, But Kalen could feel the eyes on him. He saw the way other alphas looked, their gazes sliding from Kalen to Elian and back again, a silent, predatory calculus taking place. They smelled a marked Omega, publicly unacknowledged by the powerful alpha he served. To them, it was not a sign of Kalen's control, but of his profound, exploitable weakness. Or worse, it was an invitation, a challenge. Then he saw him, Marcus Thorne. He was holding a flute of champagne, speaking with a rival CEO, but his eyes, the color of rust, were locked on Elian. Thorne's scent, that cloying metallic stench, reached Kalen even from across the room, and a low, guttural growl rumbled in his chest, a sound he barely managed to suppress. It was the primal, possessive rage of an alpha whose claim was being challenged. He had to get Elian out of there. "The preliminary agenda," Kalen said, his voice a low, urgent command that was for Elian's ears only. "Bring it to my suite, now." He didn't wait for a reply. He turned and walked away, his stride measured, betraying none of the cold fury coiling in his gut. He was a director, leaving a task for his assistant. That was the narrative. He trusted Elian would follow, would understand the unspoken command to retreat, to seek shelter. But as he walked, he felt a flicker of doubt. He had seen the look in Elian's eyes lately. The quiet obedience was still there. But underneath it, something new was taking root, a hardness, a watchfulness. He reached his suite, the door hissing open to a space as Spartan and luxurious as his office. He paced the floor, the thick carpet silencing his footsteps, his rage a caged beast inside him. He was losing control. This summit, this gathering of his peers and rivals, was exposing the flaw in his strategy. By hiding the bond, he had made Elian a target. He had painted him as a prize to be stolen, a vulnerability to be leveraged. He was so focused on the strategic implications that he almost didn't register the emotional core of his fury, the searing, white-hot jealousy. The thought of Thorne's scent even touching Elian was a physical violation. The door chimed. Kalen's head snapped up. "Enter." Elian stepped inside, the datapad with the agenda held in his hands. He was composed, his face unreadable. But Kalen could smell it on him now, faint but undeniable. The foul, metallic trace of Marcus Thorne's scent, clinging to the edges of his own. Thorne must have spoken to him in the few moments it took Elian to cross the hall. The beast in Kalen's chest roared. The carefully constructed walls of Director Vance crumbled, and the Alpha stood in their place. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, his movements silent and predatory. He backed Elian against the closed door, not touching him, but boxing him in with his sheer presence. The air crackled with a tension that was thick enough to taste. "He spoke to you," Kalen stated, his voice a low, dangerous growl. It was not a question. Elian's chin lifted slightly, the first open act of defiance Kalen had ever seen from him. He asked if I was enjoying the mountain air. The words were simple, the delivery calm, but it was a challenge, a refusal to be cowed. "His scent is on you," Kalen bit out, the words tasting like acid. He leaned closer, his own scent flooding the space between them, a tidal wave of petrichor and stone meant to drown out the lingering trace of the other alpha. It was a raw, possessive, instinctual act. He was remarking his territory. Elian didn't flinch. He simply met Kalen's glacial gaze, and for the first time, Kalen saw the profound, bottomless well of pain in his eyes. "And whose fault is that?" Elian's voice was barely a whisper, but it struck Kalen with the force of a physical blow. You present me to the world as unclaimed, as available. Do not be surprised when they believe you. The truth of the words was a shard of ice in Kalen's gut. He had done this. His strategy, his control, his fear. It had all led to this, to the quiet, devastating accusation in the eyes of the Omega he had sworn to protect by destroying him. The rage drained out of him, replaced by a cold, vast emptiness. He was the architect of his own personal hell, and he had dragged Elian into it with him. He said nothing. He simply stood there, inches from Elian, the two of them trapped in a web of unspoken truths and biological imperatives, the silence in the room screaming louder than any argument. The moment stretched, thin and brittle, in the suffocating silence of the suite. Kalen's proximity was an overwhelming sensory assault. His scent, no longer a phantom presence, but a physical force, saturated the air, seeking to reclaim, to purify, to erase the taint of another alpha. For Elian, it was both a balm and a brand. The instinctual Omega part of him craved this reassurance, this undeniable proof of his alpha's claim. It was a deep, cellular settling, a quiet hum of rightness that resonated in his bones. But his mind, his sense of self, rebelled. This was not an act of love or partnership. It was an act of ownership, a reassertion of control. He was a possession being polished, a territory being remarked. The whisper of his own words still hung in the air between them. Whose fault is that? He had expected anger, a cold dismissal, perhaps even a physical punishment for his insolence. He had not expected the sudden, stark emptiness in Kalen's eyes. The raw fury had vanished, leaving behind something that looked unnervingly like desolation. It was a crack in the granite facade, a glimpse of the man suffocating beneath the title of director. Kalen slowly, deliberately, stepped back. The intensity of his presence receded, giving Elian room to breathe. The air still thrummed with tension, but the immediate threat had passed. Kalen turned away, walking to the suite's sterile refreshment unit. He poured a glass of water, his movement stiff, overly precise. He was rebuilding his walls, brick by painstaking brick. "You will not speak to him again," Kalen said, his back still to Elian. His voice was flat, stripped of the earlier guttural emotion. It was an order, clinical, absolute. "You will not leave my side for the remainder of the summit. If you are not in this suite, you are within arm's reach of me. Is that understood?" "Yes, Director," Elian replied, the title feeling more like a weapon than ever before. He understood perfectly. He was not to be protected, he was to be guarded, a valuable asset being kept from the hands of a competitor. The bitter taste of resignation filled his mouth. But beneath it, the small, hard seed of defiance remained. Kalen had revealed a weakness. Not just the bond itself, but his visceral, uncontrolled reaction to Thorn. It was information, and information was power. That night, sleep offered no escape. Elian lay in the small adjoining room designated for staff, the bed comfortable but cold. The scent of Kalen seeped through the ventilation system, a constant low thrum that kept his own instincts on a knife's edge. He was exhausted, but his mind raced. He thought of the look on Thorn's face, the smug, assessing curiosity. He thought of the other alphas, their predatory glances. They all saw him as a pawn, a tool, a means to an end, a way to get to Kalen. And he thought of Kalen, the flash of desolation in his eyes, a man so terrified of vulnerability that he had weaponized his own control against the one person he was instinctually driven to protect. A profound, aching pity mixed with his resentment, a confusing cocktail of emotion that left him feeling hollow. He couldn't stay like this. He couldn't live as a secret, a liability, a ghost. The bond, meant to be a source of strength and comfort, had become a chain. And a chain could be broken, or it could be wielded. The thought was audacious, seditious. He got out of bed, the floor cold beneath his bare feet. He crept to the door connecting their rooms and listened. Silence. He slipped into the main suite. It was dark, save for the cool blue-white light of the city grid far below, painting stark geometric patterns on the floor. Kalen was standing by the window, a dark silhouette against the glass. He hadn't been sleeping either. Elian didn't make a sound, but Kalen knew he was there. An alpha always knows where his omega is. "You should be resting," Kalen said, his voice low and rough, not turning around. "We have an early start." "I can't rest," Elian said, his own voice surprisingly steady. He took a step forward, into the pale light. "This situation, it's untenable." Kalen finally turned. His face was a mask of shadows, his eyes unreadable pits of darkness. "There is no situation. There is a director and his assistant. There is a job to be done." The denial was automatic, rote, a lie so practiced it was almost convincing. "No," Elian said, taking another step. He was closer now than he had been since the incident in the corridor, a choice he was making freely. "There is an alpha who has marked an omega, an alpha who is so afraid of that bond that he is willing to let the world think his omega is unclaimed and unprotected. He is inviting the very danger he claims to be protecting me from." Kalen's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped in his cheek. "You don't understand the politics, the history." "I understand that I am a human being," Elian interrupted, his voice rising with a passion he hadn't felt in months. "I am not a strategic liability. I am not a dirty secret to be hidden away. This mark on my scent, your scent on me, it is a part of me now. And by denying it, you are denying my existence. You are erasing me." He was shaking, the words pouring out of him, a torrent of pain and frustration held back for too long. He had crossed a line. There was no going back. He had challenged his director, his alpha. The consequences would be severe. He braced himself, but Kalen did not lash out. He simply stared, and in the faint light, Elian saw that the desolation was back, deeper this time. He looked like a man watching his empire burn. "What do you want, Elian?" Kalen asked, his voice raw, stripped of all artifice. The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of all the things they could never have. Elian's breath hitched. What did he want? He wanted a life. He wanted a name that was his own. He wanted to walk into a room and not be judged as a scandalous secret. He wanted the bond to be a source of pride, not shame. He looked at the powerful, broken man in front of him. "I want you to choose," Elian whispered, the words costing him everything. "Hide me and lose me to the wolves you've invited, or claim me and face the consequences together." It was an ultimatum, a Saizio declaration of war against the prison they had built. And as he stood there, vulnerable and defiant in the pale moonlight, he knew that whatever Kalen chose, nothing would ever be the same again. The ultimatum lay between them, a living thing in the silent, moonlit room. Choose. The single word echoed in the vast emptiness of Kalen's soul. It was a demand he had spent his entire adult life avoiding. His path had always been one of singular, ruthless focus. Accumulate power, maintain control, eliminate vulnerabilities. He did not make choices based on emotion. He made calculations based on risk. And Elian, standing before him, beautifully, terrifyingly defiant, was a risk he could not quantify. To claim him would be to paint a target on both their backs. It would validate every rumor, confirm every suspicion. Marcus Thorne and others like him would descend, not just on Kaelin's corporate empire, but on their lives. They would use the bond, twist it, leverage it. They would try to break Elian to control Kaelin. It was the exact scenario that had destroyed his grandfather, the history he had sworn never to repeat. To continue hiding him, however, was no longer a viable option. Elian's words had stripped away that illusion. Hiding him was not protecting him. It was baiting the trap. It was a slow execution of Elian's spirit, and it was making Kaelin's own instincts feral and unpredictable. He was becoming the one thing he despised, a creature ruled by impulse, his control fracturing under the strain of the lie. He looked at Elian, truly looked at him, not as an assistant or a complication, but as the Omega his soul had recognized in that moment of darkness and terror. He saw the proud set of his jaw, the tremor of fear he was refusing to show, the profound exhaustion in his eyes that mirrored his own. They were two sides of the same coin, both trapped by a system that demanded they deny the most fundamental part of themselves. What was the point of his empire if he had to live like a ghost within it? What was the value of his power if it could not protect the one person who mattered? The realization dawned on him, cold and stark and liberating. His control was not strength. It was a cage, a gilded, powerful cage, but a cage nonetheless. And Elian was offering him a key. The consequences, Kaelin began, his voice raspy. They will be severe. It was not a refusal. It was a warning, a test. Elian's chin did not waver. I am already living the consequences, Kaelin. He used his first name, a small seismic shift in the foundation of their world. It was an acknowledgement of the man, not the director. My consequences are loneliness and fear. I would rather face theirs with you than face mine alone. Kaelin felt the last of his defenses crumble. The cold logic, the years of self-imposed discipline, the ghost of his grandfather, it all fell away, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth of the bond. A bond that was not a weakness, but a strength he had been too afraid to accept. He took a step forward, closing the space between them. He slowly, gently, raised a hand, not to command or to restrain, but to touch. His fingers brushed against Elian's cheek, the skin soft, the touch electric. He felt the slight tremor that ran through Elian's body and the answering pull in his own gut. He leaned in, his forehead resting against Elian's. He inhaled, and for the first time, he did not fight his instincts. He let Elian's scent fill him, the clean, sweet fragrance of clover and parchment, and underneath it, the unique, inimitable scent of Elian himself. It was the scent of home. All right, Kaelin breathed, the word a vow, a surrender, a declaration. It was the most terrifying and honest word he had ever spoken. Together. A single tear escaped Elian's eye, tracing a hot path over Kaelin's cold fingers. It was not a tear of sadness, but of release. The tension that had held his body rigid for months finally let go, and he sagged against Kaelin. Not in defeat, but in trust. Kaelin's arms came around him, holding him, supporting him. It was not the desperate, possessive clutch of the alpha in the dark corridor. It was a quiet, solid embrace, a promise. They stood like that for a long time, two silhouettes against the distant, uncaring city lights, the silence of the suite no longer a void of tension, but a space of quiet communion. The path ahead was unknown, fraught with danger. They would likely lose everything. But in that moment, holding each other, the lie finally dead between them, they had already gained more than they could ever lose. The next morning, they walked into the main summit hall together. Kalen did not walk ahead, with Elian trailing behind like a servant. They walked side by side. Kalen's hand rested, possessively and publicly, on the small of Elian's back. He had removed Elian's scent-neutralizing patches himself, an intimate, symbolic gesture performed in the quiet dawn. Now, Elian's true scent, overlaid with Kalen's undeniable claim, radiated into the cold mountain air. It was a silent, unambiguous declaration to the room full of predators. The chatter in the hall died down as they entered. Every head turned. Every alpha's eyes widened in shock, their nostrils flaring. They saw Director Vance, the man of ice and control, publicly claiming his Omega assistant. They smelled the truth, raw and unfiltered. Marcus Thorne stood near the center of the room, a glass of juice in his hand. He froze, his eyes locking onto Kalen's hand on Elian's back. The smug curiosity on his face curdled into a mask of disbelief, then fury. Kalen met his gaze, his own eyes cold and hard as diamonds. There was no apology, no explanation, just a silent, immovable statement. He is mine. Challenge that at your peril. This was not a strategic maneuver. It was an act of rebellion, an act of truth. And as they walked toward their seats, the keen, entire world shifting around them, Elian felt a sense of calm he had never known. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, burning pride. He was no longer a secret. He was no longer invisible. He was Kalen's Omega, and they would face the coming storm together. The aftermath of their public declaration was not a fiery explosion, but the deafening silence that precedes a tsunami. The remaining days of the summit passed in a haze of surreal tension. Whispers followed them down every corridor. Business discussions were laced with unspoken questions, and the gazes of the other alphas were a mixture of shock, contempt, and a new, grudging respect for Kalen's audacity. Marcus Thorne avoided them entirely, his public facade one of cool indifference, but Kalen could feel the man's simmering rage from across any room, a promise of retribution to come. The return to Ethelberg was a descent from the cold, clear air of the mountains back into the smog of political intrigue. The moment they stepped into the corporate spire, they could feel the change. The deference shown to Kalen was now tinged with fear and morbid curiosity. Elian was no longer invisible. He was a spectacle. The staff, from the executives to the janitorial crew, either stared openly or went to great lengths to avoid looking at him at all. He was the Omega who had somehow ensnared the untouchable Director Vance. He was either a brilliant manipulator or a tragic victim, and the speculation was a palpable poison in the air. Kalen, for his part, seemed impervious. He moved through his days with the same cold efficiency as before, but there was a subtle shift in his demeanor. He was more present, more grounded. He had made his choice, and in doing so had shed the crushing weight of his lifelong lie. The fear was still there. He admitted to Elian one night, a quiet confession in the dark of his private apartment where Elian now stayed. But it was a clean fear now, a rational assessment of the threats they faced, not the corrosive, soul-eating terror of self-betrayal. Their relationship in private began to transform. The formal titles of director and assistant fell away, replaced by hesitant, then confident, use of their first names. They were clumsy in this new territory of emotional honesty. Kalen, a man who had treated feelings as a foreign language, struggled to articulate the possessive, protective instincts that drove him. Ilian, who had suppressed his own needs for so long, found it difficult to ask for comfort or to express the depth of his anxiety. But they learned. They learned through small gestures. Kalen would place a hand on Elian's shoulder as he passed his desk, a simple, grounding touch that spoke volumes. Elian would brew Kalen's preferred tea without being asked, a quiet act of care that acknowledged the man, not just the boss. Their bond, once a source of torment, began to heal. In the safety of the apartment, Kalen's scent was a constant comfort, a warm blanket of security, and Elian, no longer erasing his own scent, allowed the subtle notes of clover and parchment to fill the space, a gentle counterpoint to Kalen's earthy power. He was becoming himself again. He began to research, not for an escape route, but for a battle plan. He delved into the corporate bylaws, the history of the Vance family, the tangled web of alliances and rivalries that defined their world. He had spent months as the perfect assistant, absorbing every piece of data, every whisper of gossip. He knew where the bodies were buried. He was no longer just an Omega to be protected. He was becoming a strategist in his own right. Thorne's power base is in the off-world logistics division, Elian said one evening, pointing to a complex flowchart he had projected onto the wall of the apartment. He's been skimming profits through a series of shell corporations for years. The board suspects, but they have no definitive proof because the data trails are masked by diplomatic immunity clauses with the outer colonies. Kalen stood behind him, looking at the data. He rested his chin on Elian's shoulder, inhaling his scent. The casual intimacy of the gesture was still new, still breathtaking. "My father knew," Kalen murmured, his voice a low rumble against Elian's ear. He considered it the cost of keeping Thorne loyal. A mistake. "It's his primary weakness," Elian continued, his focus sharp. "If we can find a way to bypass the immunity clauses, we can expose him. But he'll retaliate. He won't go after your position directly. He'll go after me. I know." Kalen's arms wrapped around Elian's waist, pulling him back against his chest. "He will try to have the bond legally nullified. He'll claim I took advantage of my position, that you were coerced." The cold reality of their world settled over them. An alpha-omega bond, especially one between a superior and a subordinate, could be challenged before the corporate tribunal. If coercion was proven, the Omega would be reassigned, essentially given to another alpha as property, and the offending alpha would face disgrace and ruin. It was the weapon Thorne was sharpening for them. "Then we have to discredit him before he can act," Elian said, his voice quiet but firm. "We have to give the board a reason to side with us, a reason to see him as a greater liability than our bond." Kalen tightened his hold. He was a man of power, a man who commanded armies of lawyers and analysts. But in this fight, his most valuable asset was the quiet, brilliant Omega in his arms, the supposed weakness who was turning out to be his greatest strength. "We," Kalen said, the word a promise. "I like the sound of that." The first shot was fired a week later. A formal inquiry was delivered to Kalen's office. It was a summons to appear before an emergency session of the board of directors. The stated reason was a review of executive conduct and potential conflicts of interest. The unspoken reason was clear. Marcus Thorne was making his move. The war had begun. The boardroom was a theater of corporate warfare, designed for intimidation. A long, polished table of dark, petrified wood sat under a single, harsh strip of overhead lighting, creating the atmosphere of an interrogation chamber. The 10 members of the board were already seated, their faces grim, impassive masks. Marcus Thorne sat at the opposite end from the head chair, his position a clear challenge to Kalen's authority. His rusty-colored eyes gleamed with triumph. He believed he had already won. Elian stood at Kalen's side, slightly behind him. He was not there as an assistant, but as a party to the proceedings. His presence was a quiet scandal in itself. He wore a simple, dark suit, his posture straight, his hands clasped calmly behind his back. He met the gazes of the board members without flinching, his scent clean and clear and irrevocably marked by Kalen, a silent testament to his place. Kalen took his seat at the head of the table. He did not appear stressed or cornered. He radiated an aura of calm, formidable power that seemed to suck the very air out of the room. He placed a single, thin data pad on the table before him and folded his hands. "Mr. Thorne," Kalen began, his voice a low, resonant baritone that commanded attention. "You requested this emergency session. The floor is yours." Thorne leaned forward, a predatory smile touching his lips. "Thank you, Director Vance. Or perhaps, for the purposes of this meeting, I should just say Kalen." The use of his first name was a deliberate, disrespectful jab. "This board has a fiduciary duty to protect the interests of our shareholders. That duty requires us to eliminate any and all liabilities, and I believe we are facing the greatest liability in this corporation's history." His gaze flickered to Elian, dripping with contempt. An illicit, undocumented, and highly inappropriate bond between a director and his subordinate. An Omega assistant. It reeks of coercion, of an abuse of power. It opens us up to lawsuits, to scandal, to corporate espionage. A man who cannot control his baser instincts cannot be trusted to control this company. The words were a poisoned dart, aimed directly at the heart of Kalen's family history. Kalen's expression did not change. He was a mountain, unmovable. "Your concern for the company's welfare is touching, Marcus," Kalen said, his voice laced with ice. "But your accusations are baseless. My bond with Elian is a private matter." "Is it?" Thorne shot back, his voice rising. "Was it a private matter when you flaunted him at the Elysian summit? When you disrupted the delicate political balance of that gathering with your display? Was it a private matter when you compromised your own security protocols by allowing an Omega with divided loyalties into your private quarters?" He was playing to the board's worst fears, their deep-seated prejudice against Omegas in positions of trust. He was painting Elian as a honeypot, a spy. Elian felt a surge of cold anger. He had been prepared for this, but the venom in Thorne's voice was still a shock. He felt Kalen's scent thicken in the air, a low, warning rumble of protective fury. "My loyalty is not divided," Elian said, his voice clear and steady. Every head in the room swiveled toward him. An Omega speaking in a board meeting without being addressed was unheard of. Thorne looked at him as if he were a piece of furniture that had just spoken. "My loyalty is to the man who saved my life," Elian continued, his gaze unwavering. My loyalty is to the Alpha who, in a moment of crisis, acted on instinct to protect me. The bond was not a choice made in an office. It was a fact forged in the face of death. It is Director Vance's subsequent discretion that you are attempting to frame as a scandal. Discretion, Thorn laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He hid you. He denied you. He was ashamed of you. That is not the action of an honorable Alpha. No, Kalen said, his voice cutting through the tension like a razor. That was the action of a man who has seen firsthand how men like you, Marcus, weaponize love and connection. It was a mistake I have now rectified. My only shame is that it took me so long to see that Elian's honor is worth more than this entire company. A shocked silence fell over the room. Kalen had just admitted to a profound error in judgment, a moment of vulnerability that was completely out of character. But he had framed it as a testament to Elian's worth, turning Thorn's accusation on its head. Thorn's face flushed with anger. This is sentimental nonsense. The fact remains, your judgment is compromised. You are a liability. I move for a vote of no confidence in Director Vance and for the immediate reassignment of the Omega. Several board members shifted uncomfortably. They were predators, but they were also pragmatists. They could see the battle of wills before them. Before you vote, Kalen said calmly, tapping the datapad in front of him. A holographic display bloomed to life in the center of the table, visible to everyone. It was a complex web of financial transactions, data streams, and encrypted communications. I would like to present the board with a different liability, one that has been costing our shareholders approximately 9 billion credits per quarter for the last 5 years. He looked directly at Thorn, his blue eyes as cold as a winter sky. Let's talk about the shell corporations registered in the outer colonies, Marcus. Let's talk about your off-world logistics division. Thorn's face went white. The triumphant gleam in his eyes was replaced by sheer, unadulterated panic. He had walked into a trap. Elian watched, his heart pounding. This was his research. This was the weapon he had forged, and Kalen was wielding it with devastating precision. The tables had not just turned. They had been utterly, completely shattered. The data on the holographic display was damning, undeniable. A labyrinth of offshore accounts, falsified shipping manifests, and laundered funds that all traced a path back to one source, Marcus Thorn. Elian had spent weeks painstakingly connecting the dots, bypassing firewalls and decrypting ledgers that Thorn had believed were impenetrable. He had found the key, a single recurring algorithm hidden in the metadata of diplomatic dispatches, a digital fingerprint that Thorn had carelessly reused. It was the arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. Now that arrogance was being laid bare for the entire board to see. The blood drained from Thorn's face, leaving it a pasty, mottled grey. The predatory smirk was gone, replaced by the slack-jawed gape of a cornered animal. "This is fabricated," he stammered, his voice losing its confident timbre. "A desperate, slanderous attack to deflect from your own misconduct." "Is it?" Kalen's voice was lethally soft. He made a small gesture on his datapad and the display shifted, highlighting a direct funds transfer from one of the shell corporations to a private account under an alias. Then a second window opened beside it, showing security footage from a high-end jeweler. It was time-stamped from the previous month. The footage showed Marcus Thorn, clear as day, purchasing a necklace of impossible-to-get Martian blood diamonds, the very same necklace his beta wife was now wearing in her latest society photo. The cost of the necklace matched the laundered funds down to the last credit. Checkmate. A collective gasp went through the room. This was not an allegation. It was an execution. Thorne stared at the screen, his breath coming in ragged pants. He looked from the incriminating evidence to Kaelin's implacable face, and finally, his gaze fell on Elian. The panic in his eyes curdled into pure, venomous hatred. He finally understood. It wasn't Kaelin's analysts who had unearthed this. It was the quiet, invisible Omega assistant. The pawn had taken the king. "You," Thorne snarled, his voice a guttural rasp. He lunged to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "You little whore, you think you've won?" In a flash, Kaelin was on his feet, moving with a speed that was terrifying. He was between Thorne and Elian before anyone could even process the movement, his body a solid, immovable shield. A low, menacing growl vibrated in his chest, the sound not of a corporate director, but of a primal alpha protecting his mate. The scent of ozone and stone flooded the room, a suffocating wave of dominant, threatening power that made every other alpha at the table flinch and lower their eyes in submission. "Sit down," Kaelin commanded, each word a spike of ice. Thorne, faced with the full, unrestrained force of Kaelin's alpha presence, physically recoiled. The instinct to obey a more dominant alpha was too strong. He stumbled back, falling heavily into his chair, his face a mask of humiliation and rage. The boardroom was silent, save for Thorne's labored breathing. The power dynamic had been irrevocably, violently reset. Kaelin stood for a moment longer, a silent, menacing guardian, before he slowly retook his seat. He smoothed his suit jacket, his composure absolute, as if nothing had happened. He looked down the length of the table at the pale, shaken faces of the board members. "The motion for a vote of no confidence," Kaelin stated, his voice returning to its cool, businesslike tone. "Is it still on the table?" One of the senior board members, an old alpha named Corvan, cleared his throat. He looked at the ruin of Marcus Thorne, then at the unassailable power of Kaelin, and finally at the calm, intelligent Omega, who stood beside him. He was a pragmatist above all else. "I believe Mr. Thorne's motion is withdrawn," Corvan said, his voice firm. "In fact, I move for an immediate vote to strip Marcus Thorne of his board seat and all corporate holdings, pending a full internal and federal investigation." "Seconded," another member piped up immediately. "All in favor?" Every hand at the table, except for Thorne's, went up. It was unanimous. It was over in less than a minute. Thorne's empire, his reputation, his entire life, had been dismantled. Security entered the room, their movements quiet and efficient. They flanked Thorne, who seemed to have aged 20 years in the last 10 minutes. He didn't resist as they helped him to his feet. As they led him away, his eyes met Elian's one last time. They were empty now, defeated. Kaelin had won. He had protected his position, he had protected Elian, he had vanquished his enemy. But as the door hissed shut behind the disgraced Thorne, a profound silence settled over the room. The board members looked at Kaelin with a new kind of fear, a new respect, but they also looked at Elian, and the calculation in their eyes was clear. Kaelin's Omega was not a liability. He was a weapon, and that, in its own way, was just as dangerous. The victory felt hollow. They had won the battle, but the war against the system, against the prejudice and fear that had forced them into this fight, was far from over. They had merely traded one enemy for 10 new, more cautious ones. As the board members filed out, offering stilted, formal congratulations to Kalen, he reached out and took Elian's hand under the table. His grip was firm, grounding, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had just been through, and everything that was still to come. They had survived, together. And for now, that was enough. The spire felt different on their way out. The air, once thick with judgment and suspicion, now carried a new current, fear. They had not just defeated an enemy, they had consolidated power in a way no one had anticipated. Kalen was no longer just the brilliant, cold director. He was the alpha who had a weaponized Omega at his side. And Elian was no longer the scandalous assistant. He was a kingmaker, a silent, deadly force. It was a new kind of cage, gilded with power instead of shame, but a cage nonetheless. They didn't speak in the elevator, a silent, mirrored cube that reflected their tired, drawn faces back at them. Elian looked at his reflection, at the man staring back. He looked older. The softness in his features had been honed to a finer, sharper edge. Beside him, Kalen's reflection was a study in control, but Elian could see the exhaustion in the set of his shoulders, the faint lines of strain around his eyes. They had won, but the cost was etched on their faces. When the doors opened to the private penthouse apartment, the silence came with them. This space, which had become their sanctuary, now felt like a fortress. Kalen went to the window, a familiar position for him, and looked out at the city lights. Elian watched him, the broad set of his back, the way the city's endless glow failed to touch the shadows that clung to him. "They're afraid of you now," Elian said softly, breaking the silence. "Of us." Kalen didn't turn. Fear is a more reliable motivator than loyalty. It will keep them in line. For a time. The pragmatism in his voice was chilling. This was the man who had rebuilt an empire from ashes. He knew how to wield power, how to leverage fear. But Elian heard the weariness beneath the words. "Is this what you want?" Elian asked, his voice gentle. "A life of constantly watching our backs, of trading one enemy for a dozen more, a boardroom full of people who fear us?" Finally, Kalen turned. His face was stark in the half-light, his blue eyes searching Elian's. "What I want," he said, his voice raw with an emotion he rarely showed, "is a life with you, a real one, not this endless war." He walked towards Elian, his steps heavy. He stopped in front of him, reaching out to cup his face, his thumb stroking his cheek. "You were magnificent in there, Elian. You were brave and brilliant and terrifying. And I have never been more proud, but I never want to put you through that again. I never want to see that look of hatred directed at you. I never want you to have to be a weapon." The confession hung in the air, a testament to how far they had come. The man who had once seen Elian as a strategic liability now saw the toll the battle had taken on him. "I chose this, Kalen," Elian said, leaning into his touch. "I chose to fight with you. I would do it again." "I know," Kalen whispered, "and that's why we can't stay here." Elian's heart stuttered. "What do you mean?" "This corporation, this city, this entire system, it's poison. It rewards the thorns of the world, and it forces people like us to become monsters just to survive. We won today, but the game is rigged. We'll never be truly free here. We'll always be looking over our shoulders." He took a deep breath, the decision settling in his eyes, solid and clear. I'm selling my shares, all of them, my seat on the board. I'm liquidating everything. We're going to walk away. Elian stared at him, stunned. Kalen's entire identity was tied to this company. It was his family's legacy, the empire he had painstakingly rebuilt. To walk away from it was unthinkable. But it's your life's work, Elian breathed. It was, Kalen corrected him gently. It was my life's work to restore my family's name, to prove that I was stronger than the man who came before me. I've done that. My new life's work, he said, his gaze softening, his thumb tracing the line of Elian's jaw, is you, is us. Finding a place where your scent is not a liability and my name is not a target. A place where we can just be. The proposition was terrifying and exhilarating, to leave everything they knew, all the power and the danger, and start over with nothing but each other. It was a leap into the unknown, a flight from a gilded cage into a frightening, open sky. But the thought of it, the thought of a quiet place, a small home, a life where their bond was not a political statement but simply a fact of their existence, was a hope so bright it made his eyes water. "Where would we go?" Elian asked, his voice thick with emotion. Kalen smiled, a rare, genuine smile that transformed his severe features, making him look younger, freer. "I have a place, a small property my grandfather bought on the coast of the Outer Isles back before everything fell apart. He always said it was the only place he could breathe. It's remote, quiet, no boardrooms, no spires, just the sea and the sky." He rested his forehead against Elian's, their scents mingling in the quiet air, petrichor and clover, stone and parchment, a promise of a new world. "I don't need an empire, Elian," Kalen murmured, his voice a vow against Elian's skin. "I just need you." Elian closed his eyes, a profound sense of peace settling over him for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. The fear was gone, replaced by a steady, radiant hope. They had been a director and his assistant, an alpha and his omega, a master and his weapon. But now, finally, they were just Kalen and Elian, and they were going home.